Thank you for coming to tonight's program featuring Tom Brokaw and Marty Kaplan. I'm Andrea Grossman, founder of WritersBloc, and we so appreciate your being here with us tonight. You could, after all, be at home watching NBC News, but only here do you get Tom Brokaw, the Dean of Network News. But more about Marty and Tom in a moment. If you're not yet on the WritersBloc mailing list, do visit writersblocpresents.com. Upcoming events include the now sold-out event with Elmore Leonard and the guys from Justified, Andy Borowitz with Sarah Silverman, Rachel Maddow, Eric Larson, former Senator Russ Feingold, and many more. Now for tonight. Ooh, all this muttering. That's good. Now for tonight. The promise of any campaign season is that we as a nation examine and sometimes redefine our identity and our goals. What we can all agree on is that so far it's been entertaining for many, frustrating for some, and not a lot of soul-searching in evidence. Amid the clatter of the pending election, Tom Brokaw has given us a book that can start the conversation in earnest. And who is in a better position to do that than one of the most respected journalists in contemporary American broadcast journalism, someone who's covered the most significant events of the past several decades here and around the world. In his new book, The Time of Our Lives, A Conversation About America, Tom asks us to take a step back and to engage with ourselves and with each other about how we as individuals can change our communities and our country. If all politics is local, then it makes sense that change starts right here in our own local communities and builds to a national level. The Time of Our Lives really is a conversation about our country and our value system between Tom Brokaw and us, the readers. He presents us with a question at each chapter and explores the question in the most personal and engaging way. Questions that challenge us to rethink our lifestyles, our personal spending, our commitment to our neighborhood, the value of education. In essence, Tom asks us to reflect on how we relate to our community and our country, because to reclaim the greatness and the progress that we've taken for granted, we need to do some serious thinking and take action. It's a book for all generations, and he recognizes the power and energy of grandparents and the different kind of power and energy in students and young people. If in Tom's unbreakable and unshakable optimism and in his forthright voice, his observations and questions lead to promise and good. Marty Kaplan is someone who knows how to ask the right questions, too. On a personal note, Marty has sat in the interviewer seat for WritersBloc on several great occasions, and perhaps some of you were fortunate enough to attend one notable evening when he interviewed Peter Jennings for us. Marty pays attention to the news and comes at it from so many perspectives. He's been a White House speechwriter, a studio executive, and a journalist. And as the Norman Lear Professor of Entertainment, Media, and Society at USC's Annenberg School, he's the go-to guy when reporters need clarity and cultural context. When we, the public, seek clarity and context, we turn to Tom Brokaw and his colleagues. Then the colleagues turn to Marty. So here's what will happen tonight. Tom and Marty will talk, and feel free to ask questions from the two mics in the audience when they're through. Afterwards, Tom will sign copies of The Time of Our Lives. Remember, folks, Christmas is right upon us. Hanukkah is even closer, I think, but they're all dangerously close. Skylight Books is here with tons, literally tons of books in anticipation of your Christmas and Hanukkah needs, and Tom will sign them so that you can, and we'll even help you out to your cars, with the stacks you're going to get. He's already signed a whole batch of them in the green room, so many of them are just ready to go if you don't want to wait for him to sign in line for you. This is his only public appearance in Los Angeles. Take advantage of him and have him sign his terrific book. Thank you. Tom Brokaw, Marty Kaplan.
Tom, you have a lot of fans here tonight, and full disclosure, I'm a fan too. So that's where I'm coming from. But we are in the Writers Guild Theater, and as a member of the Writers Guild, I quickly learned that the expression, without conflict, no drama. And so from time to time, if I maybe prod and provoke and try to object. It's in order to keep things lively, not because I think you're all wet. I'm going to start by just getting right to this. I couldn't resist it. I'm quoting from a review of Tom's book in Reason magazine, the Libertarian magazine, just a few weeks ago. It says, Mr. Brokaw will be 72 in 2012, the same age as John McCain was in 2008, and a year younger than Ronald Reagan was when he was reelected in 1984. But if the political media establishment or the electorate are hungering for a candidate in 2012 who isn't Barack Obama, Rick Perry, Herman Cain, or Mitt Romney, and if Michael Bloomberg isn't going to run, well, let's just say that the debates could be livelier next year if Mr. Brokaw participates not as a moderator, but as a candidate. So are you ruling this out, Mr. Brokaw?
The only thing I'm running for is for the border, actually, if things continue the way they are. No, actually, the more serious response is that I'm a journalist. That's all I've ever been. That's all I've ever wanted to be. I think that we have an important role in the public discourse in an election year. I hope that my voice, especially as it's embodied in this book, and what I have to say in the course of the next year will help expand and advance the dialogue that we all need to be having with each other. I don't remember a time, Marty, and I reflect this in the time of our lives, and I'm curious to know about whether you agree with this, when we have had the kind of acute polarization that we do now. We've had it pretty seriously in the past on a number of occasions, but I don't remember a time when people just simply refuse to talk to each other, that they've gone to the far corners of the room and they don't want to listen, they only want to shout. And some of that is exacerbated, obviously, by talk radio and cable television, especially, in my judgment, by the blogosphere, in which you can kind of unleash a jihad against a candidate if they don't meet your specifications based on your very narrow interest. So what I've tried to do in this book really is to not to so much recruit candidates, but to change the tone of the dialogue.
Well, that takes us right into something that I want to spend a chunk of tonight talking about, which is the argument, the case you make in the book. For those of you who have not read it yet or don't know about it, it's more than one book. The two are integrated. One book is about this, and the other is very personal. It's you get to learn a whole lot about who Tom is and where he comes from and who's important in his life, and so I also want to make sure we leave some time to talk about that as well. So just to start with what you just said, your book starts with a premise that we America, are adrift. We've lost our way. That's something you've picked up as you've traveled, yes?
It is. I've been doing this for almost 50 years now, starting in the precincts of Omaha, Nebraska, to Atlanta, Los Angeles, all through the 1960s out here, as some of you know, and then to Washington for Watergate, the Today Show, Nightly News, and then around the world.
I'm exhausted already.
Right. And so am I, by the way. But I don't, as I indicated earlier, at first I thought maybe I'm just getting to be an old fogey, and I'm looking at the past through rose-colored glasses. But I've actually gone and checked the data, looked at things objectively, talked to a lot of people around for as long as I've been, and everyone agrees. And what I think is most distressing about it is that for the first time, I'm seeing a country that really has kind of lost its confidence in terms of where we're going to go and how we're going to get there. And the central question that I keep hearing, especially from people, those of you in the demographic in this audience and my generation and the boomers, up and down the boomer scale, for the first time, people are saying to me, I don't think my children will have the kind of life that I've had. That gets to the heart of the American dream. So I've been trying to retool really the answer to that and say maybe we should recalibrate that question, because it's always had a kind of quantitative underpinning to it. Will they make more money than I do? Will they have a larger house? Will they travel more? Will they have a bigger job than I've had? Will they have more toys? I say, there's a finite capacity for all that, and we also learned there's a price that comes with it during the course of this economic downturn. So let's try to retool that question in this country to make it a qualitative question. Will we have more economic justice in America? Will we create the same opportunities in terms of the demands of the new workplace for those at the lower end of the socioeconomic class as we do for those who get an education in the white suburbs of America? Are we going to be able to use these new tools that are truly transformative, the tools of information technology and cyber technology? Are we going to use those for instruments that will enhance and expand wisdom, or will we be using those as kind of laser-like weapons against people that don't agree with our particular point of view, or in too many instances now, I think with young people, use it as a form of anonymous bullying tactics? And those are the kinds of conversations that I would like to see emerge during this time, because I believe that the country, once you get outside the Beltway, really is up on its toes and kind of leaning forward and saying, we've got to take stock of who we are, and we've got to find a process in which we can initiate these conversations.
To pick up on the word conversation, your subtitle is A Conversation About America, and often in the book you talk about we need a conversation about what you just said, about various things in particular. We need a dialogue. In this America that we live in right now, what does it look like to have a national conversation? Where does that happen? How does that work?
Well, I had one this morning. I was on NPR in Pasadena, and I'm with Larry, and I had a wonderful conversation with him about this. And he wasn't in my face the entire time. And in fact, as I told you earlier, I was on Fox News this morning, and all three of the anchors asked me really important questions, and they had real context to them. And that's not routine on the morning talk shows, and it's not just on Fox, it's across the board. So I think that there is a hunger for it. One of the qualities that I've always cherished as a journalist is that I grew up in working-class America in small towns and spent a lot of time on Main Street, and as a result of that, I can land almost anywhere in this country on Main Street and within about 20 minutes tell you where the Republicans are having coffee in the morning and where the Democrats are having coffee in the morning and what they're talking about. So these conversations do go on all day in this country. What we need to do is to expand the megaphone for that. I've even suggested to some people that, in fact, what we require at the moment is a kind of coalition for the higher ground, and that would encompass more people, not all of them from one party or the other, including the independents, but people who have real anxieties about where we're going. Let me say something that may surprise you. The Tea Party, and by the way, I shared what I thought was the DNA of the country before the Tea Party became the institution that it's become, with people at the White House and also on Capitol Hill after going across America in 2009 on Highway 50. And I came back and I said, about half this country is ticked off in a half-cocked position. I didn't use the phrase ticked off. I used a more vivid phrase.
Did you say half-cocked?
Yes, right. I did say half-cocked. And they don't believe in anything anymore. The Tea Party grew out of that. Here's the deal with the Tea Party. They played by the rules. They got angry. They got organized. They got to Washington. They stayed on message, and they've stayed disciplined. Now, most of the country, in fact, the vast majority of the country doesn't believe in the goals of the Tea Party, but the Tea Party does. And as a result, they're having an impact, especially in the Republican presidential nomination race, way out of proportion to their numbers. But it's because they organized. And it's because they used all the tools that were available to them to stay organized. There are some of the Tea Party members, I heard from one of them today, who have real intellectual firepower. These are true libertarians who believe in what they're doing, and they get up every morning committed to it. So it takes that kind of intellectual discipline and that kind of organizational energy to begin to move things. And think of the impact that they've had. If you'll just permit me, two other examples that I use in the book. People say, I'm just one person, I can't do any of this. Or, the problems are too big. I use in the book two very popular examples of organizational strength in America. One is a woman from Maryland who had a daughter who was killed by a drunk driver. and said, this is outrageous what we have going on in this country. Her name is Candace Lightner. A lot of you know who she is. She founded Mothers Against Drunk Driving. She had a profound effect in this country about social behavior, about drinking and driving, about the laws. I remember in Los Angeles that, if you got stopped after having a few pops, you often got let go. Now you go to jail. And it shows up, and you often get your license taken away from you. Bars and restaurants have to have a different attitude about it. Thousands of lives have been changed as a result of that one mother's outrage. 2 years ago, I went back to my home state of South Dakota as a favor to a friend who had been a breast cancer survivor, and she was the chair of the Komen Race for the Cure. I kind of vaguely knew what Komen Race for the Cure was, but I got back there, and on a Saturday morning during pheasant hunting season, which is a religious holiday in South Dakota, there were 4,000 people who showed up to race for the cure. The next day I was back in New York at a football game, and everybody came on the field with pink chin straps and pink shoelaces. And that was Nancy Brinker, who made a pledge to her sister that I'll try to organize something that will advance the race for the cure for breast cancer. Those are just two examples of how the country was moved, and people gravitated to those movements because they believed in them.
Those latter two are private individuals in the nonprofit sector. You started by talking about the Tea Party and its impact. I'm wondering, do you think that an election season in America now is a place in which we can have an intelligent conversation?
It's tougher. There's no question about that, because the megaphone is so expanded and it has so many parts now. I mean, it's kind of a lot of people yelling at you either from cable television or talk radio or on the blogosphere, and some of this stuff is pretty vitriolic. I mean, and that's across the political spectrum. But unless we begin to have that conversation, we're going to defeat ourselves. The fact is that if I took you to Iowa for the caucuses or to New Hampshire, the first two states, these are states that take great pride in their important role in the beginning of the process. And as a result, they do have these conversations, Marty, up and down the main streets of little towns in Iowa, Carroll, Iowa, or Riceville, or Osage. There are folks who are gathering, and they're talking about who could be the best candidate for them, who they'd like to see in the White House, and they kick it around. And as you know, in New Hampshire, I mean, this is not just a cliche. I've actually had New Hampshire residents say to me, I'll say, well, who have you settled on? And they'll say, well, I don't know. I've only met him 3 times, so I haven't made up my mind yet. It's a very personal connection, and they take it very seriously. As you know, having been up there, they have very sophisticated attitudes about what's going on. I had a wonderful personal experience there in 2000 when John McCain was running what turned out to be an upset victory over George Bush 43. And Meredith went with me because we'd heard that McCain had kind of caught fire, and we were in American Legion Hall. And John McCain was standing up in front of the American Legion Hall, and he was taking questions from everyone about everything and responding to them directly. He opened his remarks by saying that Tom Brokaw wrote a book called The Greatest Generation, about how much we owe that generation and how we're the beneficiaries of that, and we have to think about what they did, and now we have to apply those lessons to where we are now. He begins all these conversations. He said 2 things in the course of this. A Navy guy got up, an Air Force guy got up, and he said, Senator, I think the only thing you've done wrong in your life is that you're in the Navy. I'm an Air Force man. And then he said, and by the way, did you know that Tom Brokaw is in the back of the hall? And then he asked a question about Medicare. And Senator McCain looked at him and said, that Air Force Navy business, he said, I want to go in the Air Force, but I couldn't because my parents were married. I mean, nowhere else but in New Hampshire could you get away with that kind of a statement. If that happened today, it would be the fodder of all cable and would go viral immediately. But it broke up the hall, and it was John McCain. And then he said, I did know that Brokaw is here. He said he's a leading member of the Trotskyite press in America, and he's standing there at the back of the stage. It's that kind of dialogue that we need to have again, because politics should be engaging, and people should be able to say those kinds of things and pull everyone in. And they walked out of there having a pretty good feeling about John McCain. And we've lost that because every word now is measured. 4 years later, or pardon me, 8 years later when John McCain was the candidate, as he was against Barack Obama, one of his principal aides, a man that I've stayed in touch with, a speechwriter, said, we just can't connect to the younger journalist. He said, we're a different generation. He said, I call them up to the front of the airplane. They're all tweeters, and they're just waiting for the senator to make a small mistake or to be slightly inconsistent so they can go back and tweet on that or file it on their blog in some fashion. He said, as a result, we just don't have the freedom to have the conversation that we've had 8 years ago in the country. And I think that's a loss, frankly.
I want to turn to some of the specific problems you talk about and some of the potential solutions. But before I do, just one more line of inquiry about what you've been talking about. You mentioned vitriol across the political spectrum and how we are polarized, and about the not particularly attractive role the blogosphere, from your point of view, has. It's my sense that one of the points that at least the left blogosphere makes, and the right in its own way, is that there is a false equivalence that says that both sides are equally culpable, that the polarization, the extremism, is as much the fault of your side as it is of my side. You hear that from the left in its way, you hear that from the right in its way. Do you think that it's fair to say that both sides are equally culpable?
I don't think that, culpable is not the right phrase I would use. Are they equally weighted? No. But I want to remind you about what the kind of target that George Bush 43 was from the left when he was in office, and the books that were written about him, the things that were said about him in the blogosphere. An incumbent president who becomes a target, and this president is a target for the right because they really want to recapture the White House next time. So they're coming after him with money marbles and chalk. There's just no question about it. There's a blog called redstate.org, and the subheading is kneecapping the president at every opportunity. That's the phrase that they use. It's there on a permanent basis. And it's that kind of language that is incendiary in a lot of ways. And it seems to empower other people then to use that kind of language. Now, having said all of that, anybody who's just a casual student of American history know that this has been a rich tradition in this country for a long, long time. One of the surprising things that I've been saying to audiences around the country is that, and I didn't realize this until recently, I'm not a serious Lincoln buff, but I'm enough of a student of Lincoln that I just can't stop reading about how he became who he was and how he became the president that he became. And I was reading one of the better biographies of him. In fact, I think the best single-volume biography of him. And it jumped out at me that he was an early blogger. When he was getting active in Illinois state politics, when he was a young man, a lawyer with some political aspirations, he was writing articles in the partisan press at the time about one of his political opponents under a pseudonym. And it was very tough stuff that he was writing, not necessarily true. And his opponent knew who was writing this. So he challenged Lincoln to a duel. And because Lincoln was the challenge man, he got to choose the weapons. And he chose broadswords because he's a long-rangey guy. And they actually met in Missouri at dawn. But cooler heads prevailed. And Lincoln, for the rest of his life, regretted having done what he did. But that was going on at that time. It was vitriol from arguably our greatest president, who had the power of eloquence to pull this country together. But at that point in his life, he was just pulling the trigger, as it were, and hiding behind someone else's name.
A sock puppet, we would call it now online.
That's right.
So let's turn to some of the problems that you focus on. And one that appropriately gets a lot of attention is the Great Recession. You call it a cautionary tale about easy credit, the folly of the boom, and big government spending. So talk a little bit about that.
Well, here's what I think. People who are a lot smarter than I am should have seen this coming. And I actually have a notebook at home that I've kept. And in the fall of 2007, I was coming back from South Dakota from pheasant hunting, and I stopped in Omaha to do a story with Warren Buffett about the inequity of payroll taxes, because that was when he was beginning his crusade. And I said to him as we were having the conversation, gee, Warren, what do you think about what's going on in the economy? This is the fall of 2007. And he said, I'm really worried about the housing crisis being a little overheated, and the stock market just can't continue on the plane that it's on now. And I wrote all that down. I found the notebook about a year ago, and I called him up, and I said, Warren, I'm reading you what you said in 2007 before all hell broke loose. And I said, I'm such a dummy. I came back to New York, and I did say that Warren seemed to be concerned about it, but I didn't act on it. He said, you think you're a dummy? Neither did I. And I'm the one who was telling you that. So there is this kind of myopia that occurs when things are going well. It seems like they will go well forever. We have a negative savings rate in this country. We've got 20 million homes with people who are either being foreclosed or they're in peril of being foreclosed. I mean, these are systematic and real issues that we have going on in our economy, and it's not going to be easy to work our way out of it. There are 6 million people who are unemployed in America. 4 million have been out of a job for a year. Now think if you're one of those people. You haven't had a job for a year. I was just in the Southeast, in Alabama and Tennessee and Georgia and that area. And 2 years ago, an international forecasting firm said that that part of America will recover its pre-recession job levels by the year 2013. They have just revamped it, and they say it's going to be 2015 or 2016. We got a way to get out of this, quite honestly. And it doesn't mean we can't. We can't bury our heads in the sand, but it's going to take a systematic approach to pull the place back together again. And that's the job that I don't think we've stepped up to entirely yet.
So when you talk about the causes of it, you just mentioned some of them, like debt and the lack of a savings and the housing bubble and so on.
I can give you some specific examples on the government side. On the government side, we went to war on a credit card. We were told by Paul Wolfowitz, among others, that if we went to war in Iraq, that we within 9 months would be sharing oil revenue with Iraq, and that we would recover at least $70 billion.
That's after they welcomed us with flowers.
Right, that's right, from war costs. We've spent over $1 trillion in Afghanistan and Iraq. We had no concomitant way of paying for that out of additional taxes for all of you. Quite the contrary, your taxes were cut. We didn't pay anything extra in gasoline taxes, for example. There were no sacrifices required whatsoever at home. No sacrifices emotionally, mentally, or financially. We sent less than 1% of our population to fight those wars. They paid a terrible price. They've come home in body bags. They've come home gravely damaged physically or emotionally. Their families live in a state of terror while they're over there. The rest of us can put those wars out of our mind. We don't even have to think about them if we choose not to, and most people don't at this stage because they've been going on for so long. President Bush, getting ready for re-election, added something called a prescription drug benefit to Medicare. Forgot to add funding for it. It's now about $1 trillion deficit on all of that. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, some of your friends were involved in those agencies. They promoted home ownership across the country and did it in a very clever way. It was a big crusade to get it. And as a result, a lot of people who became mortgage owners were not prepared for it. And that helped crater the housing industry in this country. So my argument has been during this time, it was all in. We were all participating in this. There was a lot of consumerism that went on. And now we're paying a price for it, and we're only going to get out of it by managing more skillfully our way out of it than we did managing our way into it.
What struck me, though, forgive me, is that your account of what got us to where we are now is missing one big thing, the gorilla, and that is the culpability of Wall Street. Today, a federal judge, the New York Times reported, said that Citibank had created a $1 billion fund packed with mortgages they knew were junk, sold them, and their customers lost $700 million, and Citibank bet against them and made money. And the SEC was trying to settle the case, and the judge said no. And it's one of example after example of what Wall Street was up to in the derivatives market, that feeling which has given rise to what we now call
Occupy. Right.
So why isn't that part of your case?
Well, part of the case is there, in fact. I talk at the back end of the book about failure being an option, about no one from Wall Street stepping up and admitting how gravely they had failed and continuing to take money out of Wall Street as they were leaving Wall Street. Part of the reason I didn't do it is because there's been so much attention paid to that, and I was trying to get at some of the other tertiary issues that are around it as well. But in fact, in the section called Failure as an Option, I talk about Wall Street not taking responsibility for what it did. I quote at great length, actually, Elizabeth Warren.
Yes.
Who said, Wall Street gets bailed out. Nobody's held responsible for what's that. The middle class gets clocked during all that time. And what I was trying to do was to get at other issues beyond those which are written about so often. I didn't want to make a book, again, about Wall Street because there had been so many of those. Reckless Endangerment had been written about the housing crisis. The Big Short had been written by Michael Lewis, and I was trying to get at other issues around it. But I did touch on it along the way, and that's indisputable. And that was another example of all in, by the way. But I also happen to think, and this has been going on for some time. It's not just in the last 4 or 5 years. I mean, we had children who were going into the housing market back around 2000, and one of our daughters called and said, "My God, I can't believe the kinds of deals that they wanted us to sign up for, interest only for 15 years and these huge balloon payments." And I had never seen anything like that. When Meredith and I lived in California, I cite this as an example, tell you how much times have changed here. We were buying our first house up in the valley, up above Studio City. And it was $42,500, and we could afford that. I was making good money at NBC. Then I had a chance to participate.
Which was $40,000.
Yes, that's right, exactly. It was $40,000. And then I had a chance to buy a house with a friend on the beach in Venice that would be $110,000. And it got to be worth a lot more than that. And I went back to the bank, and I had a very good contract at NBC in those days, and it showed how much I would be making for the next 3 years. And the bank wouldn't give me a loan. They said, "Well, you're a young person, and we just don't." And credit was a little tight then. This was in the 1970s, and we're not going to make the loan to you. Move the clock forward 30-some years, there would have been people crawling all over me trying to make that loan and making it interest only for a long, long time. And then you go to states like next door in Nevada, and stuff that was sold for these inflated prices. I was in a housing development outside of Reno with a family that was going through foreclosure, and they had bought a modular home for $185,000, and they were losing it. And the value of it had dropped to about $75,000. That's really what the house was worth. Under any circumstances, it was worth about $75,000. But they're stuck, and the banks are stuck, and then we're all stuck. So that's the kind of craziness that went on.
So let's move to another area you talk about, and which is both part of our problem and will be part of our solution, which is education. You describe vividly how wrong things have gotten. How did they get there? What went wrong?
I think a couple of things went wrong. I mean, I covered education a lot here in Los Angeles, and this is almost a template for what went wrong around.
That's when you were at KNBC.
When I was at KNBC.
Did anyone see Tom when he was on KNBC who's here? Yes.
Those were the glory days. But what happened is that I think, and it's always hard to objectively sort this all out, but I think what happened is you had the middle class rising in prosperity and moving out to the suburbs, and it was largely a white population, and they were building and demanding better schools for their children. What was happening then is that there was an abandonment of the inner city, and the lower socioeconomic classes were left to their own devices. And what also happened is that the teachers got organized, and they moved in, and they got bought off by school boards around the country, and they got contracts that were extraordinarily beneficial to the teachers, but not necessarily to the system, and that has to get sorted out. And then a lot of people in Manhattan, present company included, like to send my kids to public school, but I can't take a chance. I'm going to send them to private school. And we ended up with two societies, separate and unequal, in our education system. I've done 3 documentaries on education in America, and the one that was most telling was in the Milwaukee area. Right outside the Milwaukee School District is a very, very prosperous suburban school district. It's Springdale, I think, is the name of the community. It's where everybody would like to send their kids. It's one of the best school districts in America. 2 blocks away, you're in the Milwaukee inner city school district. And they have no money, and they have overcrowded classrooms, and they have one parent at home or both parents working. And it was just straddling the line between 2 Americas. We can't go forward as a society unless we raise the education level of everyone, because it's going to take everybody, quite honestly. We have 10 to 20% of our high school graduates across America now going to college having to take remedial courses in math and reading. I cite one statistic in there that in China, every 8th grader takes math, physics, and biology. In America, 18% of our high school students take those courses. In 1996, which was a long time ago, relatively speaking, I was in Seoul, South Korea for the Olympics, and I tell this story in the book about being on a roof overlooking a courtyard, and I wasn't clear what the courtyard was because we were broadcasting in the middle of the night to deal with the time difference. And before dawn, lights began to flicker on in the courtyard, and I went down after we got off the air at about 5:30, and the courtyard was filled with junior high Korean students doing their homework by flashlight, waiting for the doors to open an hour and a half later. And President Obama had the president of Korea in his office last year, and Arnie Duncan tells a story about the president saying to the president of Korea as an opening gambit in conversation, "Tell me about your challenges in education." He said, "My challenges are," he said, "that the parents are demanding more from us, not less." We don't have that going on here. I don't mean to go on at great length here. I'm not going to filibuster, but what I do find encouraging is that it is now on the agenda, and a lot of different things are being tried.
You make a couple of suggestions, some of which I suspect will be controversial. One is for an 11-month school year. And another, just to add to it, is that the higher education systems, state colleges and universities, are overbuilt, and maybe they should be regional rather than individual.
Well, what I try to do in some cases, and this is especially true in rural America, where we had a lot of state-supported institutions grow up in the beginning of the 20th century because farm kids didn't want to go too far from home. That's all changed. South Dakota and North Dakota have between them about 1,500,000 people. They have 20 institutions of higher learning. They've got 20 of them. They can at least centralize the administration and purchasing power and close down some of them and consolidate them and have better institutions. And they have 4 very good institutions at the higher level of South Dakota State, North Dakota State, and the 2 universities are very good, but they then drain a lot of their state resources off to these other places. Almost every educator that I know says that we've got to extend the school year, because so much is lost in those 3 months that they're away. It takes teachers 6 weeks to get kids kind of kick-started again back in the fall term. One of the proposals that I make is that for children who have to work, then you try to make public-private deals with employers who can give them a job in the morning or in the afternoon, and they go to school during the day, and then the employers get some tax credits for that, and they get real skill sets as work. We've got, it's no longer about reading, writing, and arithmetic. We've had this kind of one-size-fits-all attitude for far too long in this country. And there are very innovative programs going on around the country, and we just have to keep pushing and pushing and pushing.
I want to turn to the personal side, but one last question, at least for now, on the policy side. You mentioned the teachers and teachers' unions and the impact of their bargaining agreements on budgets. There have been moves in Wisconsin and Ohio to deal with that, in part by eliminating the right to collective bargain. Do you think that is a step too far?
No, I think it's a step too far. I think the teachers have a right to collective bargaining and organizing. But what has astonished me, and you're beginning to see some internal changes, you're aware, that the teachers' union just kind of got behind the barricade and said, here we take a stand. And what they should be willing to do is, two things really make me crazy about the teachers union. One is tenure. After 3 years you get tenure, and it's whether you can teach or not, by the way. And the other one is this resistance to merit pay. It's one of the few places in America where we have absolute uniform salary levels, when we know that there are teachers that are worth more than other teachers. Right. Worth more than other teachers. There's no question about that. And then other things make me... University of Mississippi has had a terrible football record with a coach that they had high expectations for, so they fired him. University of Mississippi is the poorest state in the country. They spend less on education at the elementary and secondary level than any other state in the country. It's going to cost them $6 million in a buyout to get rid of this football coach at Ole Miss. There's something out of whack about that. So we do need to make the school year longer. We need to give kids the option of that. Mike Bloomberg has come up with a cooperative agreement with IBM to create a new technology school in New York City, and it'll be grade 8 through 14, so that they can continue on through their high school years for 2 more years, and then they'll go off to someplace like MIT or Stanford or one of the other technological institutes. It's that kind of imaginative thinking that we need to bring to the school system. I don't know what you do in Los Angeles. I mean, I spent a lot of time looking at that. It's a huge school district. It's so uneven in its demographics across the board. And there was a lot of heroic work being done in this city, and every city in America, and a lot of it by public school teachers, by the way. And I cite several examples of that in there. But they're sailing against a very, very stiff headwind.
Toward the end of the book, you say something which made my head jerk. It was so stunning, and you didn't talk about it after having said it. And so I just want to ask you about it. You said that 1 week before starting as anchor for the NBC Nightly News, your dad passed away. What was that like?
It was a bittersweet experience, and it was bittersweet because it was a terrible loss and it was unexpected. He was one of those males of his generation who grew up smoking and having not the best dietary habits in the world. My father dropped out of school at the age of 10. He was really sent out of the family to go fend for himself at that age in a small town in northern South Dakota. He had a very hard childhood. But he had, in ways that we didn't know at the time until he later did his oral history, he had this idea that he could succeed at something. And what he became extraordinarily successful at was a working man. He was a master operator of heavy equipment, construction equipment, and he could fix or build anything. And he often had me at his side, and I can tell you it wasn't genetic. I mean, I kind of I knew what the tools were, but that's as far as my interest went, quite honestly. And at any rate, he had this enormous pride in what I did, but it was always, we had this wonderful relationship, but we could not have been more different in how we went through life. My father was a man of his hands and of these mechanical skills that he had. His hobby was working. He really didn't play sports. He didn't have that opportunity. He didn't go hunting. On Saturdays, he would get up and overhaul a car. Nothing would make him happier. My mother stopped saying that she needed something because he would go down to the basement and make it for her. She finally said, I want to be able to go buy an ironing board. I don't want you to have to make it for me. That's the household in which I live. So now I achieve a certain status in the field that I'm in. And this is completely contrary to my father's way of life. But he was enormously proud, and we had this wonderful, wonderful ability to communicate with each other. And I got named to the NBC Nightly News anchor job, and it came just at a time when the salaries for these jobs took a quantum leap, and for all of us across the board. So my father called me when when it was announced I would be the anchor of Nightly News, and there was a lot of speculation about how much money I was going to make. He called me from California, where Meredith and I had bought them a small retirement place down in Leisure World. And he said, so I'm reading the paper here about your new job and how much money you're going to make. And I said, Dad, we've never talked about money before. Why would we start now? And he said, well, I'm just curious. I said, okay, but let's not talk about it. So about 10 days later, Time Magazine published something in much greater detail, and it had the real aura of authenticity about it. So he calls me right back. Well, I've got Time Magazine here, and I'm reading about your salary. I said, Dad, we've never talked. Why do you keep bringing this up? And he said, well, I'll tell you why we keep bringing it up. He said, for as long as your mother and I have known you, you've always run a little short at the end of the year. We need to know how much to put aside this year for you. That was one of my last conversations with him. He died about 5 days later, and it was heartbreaking. But he had the satisfaction of knowing that his son had been named the anchor of an NBC nightly news. He'd come from a very hard-scrabble background in this desperate little town in northern South Dakota. He was living in a condominium in Southern California in which he loved to walk out of the balcony and look around at the bougainvillea and the leafiness in the middle of February and kind of look at me. And my father was very red-haired, break into a big grin and said, if the boys back in Bristol could see me now. And that helped get me through those difficult times. And I've said to other people who, just as another aside, who have lost a parent recently, I've said to them, in ways that you do not yet understand, they're going to be with you the rest of your life. You talk to them constantly. In my case, when the wiring doesn't work in the house or the plumbing goes out, I'm standing with two tools in my hand and say, Red, what in the hell do I do now? And I don't get the kind of clarity that I need from him. He would love to come to California, walk through our house, wherever we lived. He would just get out of the car, walk through the house, come back, and he'd say, okay, we got to go back in the back bedroom, Tom. And he said, you got some wiring back there that needs to be worked on. And your car, by the way, it seems to me that the brakes are not doing as well as they need to do. And that was his love of life. And it's helped form my own work ethic.
You lost your mother just a few weeks ago.
I did, here in California. And the line that has been comforting to me is that she had the best of both worlds. She had a South Dakota upbringing and a California lifestyle. My mother was a pure child of the Depression. She graduated from high school at the age of 16. College cost $100 a year. Couldn't possibly afford that. Family farm was taken over by the bank, and she met my dad. They were really could not have been more unalike in so many ways. Mother was bookish, had a wonderful sense of humor, not particularly athletic. My dad was racing motorcycles, doing all this other stuff. But it was a great, great union. And Mother, when Father died, went back to South Dakota, sold everything they had there, and said, South Dakota does not need one more widow, and came here. And just loved the last third of her life because of the range of friends that she had that she would not have had in South Dakota, the activities that she could do. Huge Lakers fan, huge Lakers. I got her tickets for the playoffs. She sat with the wives one year. Then I got her an autographed picture of Kobe Bryant. She had that on the wall of her bedroom until he got in trouble in Colorado. She took it down and put it under her bed. When they began to win again, she took it out and put it back up in the bedroom. And I said, Mother, there's some kind of situational ethics going on here that we're dealing with. At any rate, we were blessed to have her in our life as long as we did. She had a wide circle of friends. And, when I thought about the arc of her life, she really began life in a little house on the prairie and reading by kerosene lamp, no indoor plumbing. She lived long enough to log on and go to Europe on jet planes and go on luxury cruises. She couldn't afford to go to college, but she saw her granddaughters graduate from Dartmouth Medical School and from Berkeley and from Duke. And she had a full realization of all that. And about the bad old days, never a whine or never a whimper. Never, ever heard her complain about how difficult things were. And that helped give us everybody a kind of perspective. Her granddaughters adored her because she was so strong and quite free with her advice, and most of it was spot on.
There's another woman in your life, your wife of 50 years now, Meredith, who is here. Meredith, where are you? There she is. So In the book, you say about Meredith that you're not dependent, you're complementary. What do you mean by that?
Well, we have different skill sets. I say in the book, there's a little thing at NBC, they call it Team Brokaw. And almost all the members of Team Brokaw are women, by the way, who work for me as producers and editors and really kind of help me in my professional life. And there is no more important member of Team Brokaw than Meredith Brokaw, and we're both on the same team. Meredith is an expert bridge player. She is also a very, very skilled cook. And she is also wonderful at knitting. She's at the finer arts, as I like to say, and she's cool and calm about everything. I am this gregarious guy, and when I took some bridge lessons from one of our instructors, he just looked at me and looked at Meredith and said, "Cowboy, there's not much we can do with this guy." So we complement each other, and we've, over the 50 years, it'll be 50 years in August that we have been married, one of the things that we have discovered, and we did this almost intuitively, is that we have so many shared interests and we care so deeply about each other, but we've always kind of gone through life on our own separate tracks. Meredith I've been on the book tour a lot. She's just been in the Middle East with a friend of hers from California, Kathleen Brown, and they've been in Abu Dhabi and Dubai and Jordan visiting antiquities. Here's the perfect example of how our lives have been lived. We were scheduled to go on a big trek to northern Pakistan. This is some time ago, in the Hunza Valley, in the summer of 1989. Tiananmen Square blew up. I came home and said, "I can't go." Meredith said, "I'm on my way." And she took one of our daughters and left the next day, and off they went, picked up another daughter of ours who was working in Peshawar, Pakistan, and they went on this glacier trek. These women with Shiite guides, in which Meredith was really in charge. I was in China. They had a wonderful time. I had a very rewarding time. We all got back together when we got home. So it's that kind of working it out so that you're not as dependent on each other, but you support each other's interest, and you draw strength from one another. The big thing is she still laughs at my jokes. Whether she thinks they're funny or not, she still laughs at them, so that helps.
There is a sentence in the book. She's married to a man, Meredith is married to a man, who has spent their married life in one corner of the vanity business, not immune to the trappings of celebrity. What do you mean?
Well, if there's an oxymoron in American life, it is humble anchorman. We just don't exist, quite honestly. And you do get accustomed to getting the good table at the restaurant, or getting invited to opening nights, or getting the tickets for the World Series, or getting to go to the Super Bowl. The Olympics are coming up, and I'll be able to be there in the front row. But what I've always said is that when people have asked me what it's like to have grown up where I did and then to have a certain amount of recognition, what is it like for the family? And I say, well, frankly, when I get home at night and Meredith remembers what it is that I do for a living, I'm always relieved, because she's got her own interests. She's been a successful businesswoman and author. She has a whole circle of admirers who think of me not as Tom Brokaw, the anchorman, but the guy who's lucky enough to be married to Meredith, and we share those feelings. But at the same time, we were just this morning, we were at the hotel here in Beverly Hills, and we both looked at each other and remembered our days here and said, what a great life we've had, how lucky we've been. We've never lost the sense of awe about the good fortune that we've inherited from our family and from our friends, and we've never lost our sense of discovery, I think, about that, and our enormous sense of curiosity. We're going to go to an eco resort, for example, for Costa Rica with our kids, because that's the kind of thing that we really like to do. If you give me 20 seconds, I'll just tell you one story about how this works both ways. We're both active outdoors people, and we loved backpacking, starting in California, and then we did it all over the West. And so when we began to have grandchildren, we couldn't wait to take them into the backcountry. And when our San Francisco granddaughters were 7 and 5, they came to Montana to our ranch, and we said, we're going to take you on your first overnight camping trip. And they could tell there was a little anxiety about that. And it was about 3.5 miles up into the backcountry in a small cowboy cabin. And it was off trail, and there was a little kvetching about the bugs and getting through the woods and everything. But they made it, and it was a little stiffer than we thought it was going to be. And we got down, we cooked out, and then we said to the girls, you're going to sleep in the cabin, this little cowboy cabin, and You're going to sleep, and we'll be right outside in our sleeping bags. So we tucked him in. It gets very dark when it gets dark in Montana. And we were no sooner in our sleeping bags than Meredith and I could hear kind of a buzz from in the cabin. The girls were chattering with each other. About 30 seconds later, one of them hits the floor from the bunk and comes running out onto the porch. And we're down deep in our sleeping bag, and we can hear her in a very commanding voice say, they call Meredith Nan, "Nan, we need an adult in here now." I think that's kind of a metaphor for the country, quite honestly.
You actually speak quite a bit, not only about your own grandchildren, but about the fact that there are grandparents and grandchildren is an important part of our country. I'm going to quote something you said, and after you talk about it, I'm going to invite, we have a few minutes for questions, so if anyone would like to ask, could you line up at those mics that are in the aisle? So here's what you say when you're encouraging a dialogue between grandparents and grandchildren, not just yours, but for the sake of the country. And you're imagining what such a conversation would be like, what the grandparents might say. Tell me about your purple hair. Is it only me, or do others wonder what the grandparents of the randy exhibitionist cast of Jersey Shore think when they watch Snooki and Paulie and their antics? For that matter, how would you like Paris Hilton as a granddaughter? Or Charlie Sheen as a grandson? Curious minds want to know.
Well, for my generation and for the boomers, I think we were not as prepared for being grandparents as preceding generations might have been, because we thought we'd be forever young. And as I've said, and this is anecdotal on my part, but I think it probably can be backed up, that the separation between taste, between grandchildren of our generation and earlier, for example, I never dressed the same way my granddad did. Now I have running shoes and jeans, and when I'm with my grandchildren, we have shared interest in movies, and we know about the music, and we watch baseball games together, and we talk about literature in ways that has nothing to do with our ages. But part of it was that when you started to be a grandparent, you had to decide what you were going to be called. And Meredith very quickly said, "Well, I'll be called Nan. They'll call you Grandpa, like I'm Wilford Brimley or something." And I said, "No, I want to work that out if I can." Well, it worked out. They saw me a lot on television, so they call me Tom. And it always it catches everybody off. And then I went around the country and among my friends, and I started surveying about what they were called. And Peter Osnos is a publisher in New York. I said to Peter, "What are your grandchildren calling?" He said, "I have them call me Elvis. What do they know?" But my favorite was the father of a friend of our daughter's, who's a big New York real estate developer, and a guy who kind of went through a midlife crisis. He got divorced from his wife for many years, took on a trophy wife. And when his daughter became pregnant, he went to her and he said, "I'm going to be a great-grandfather. I don't want to be called Grandpa. I'm Ben. I'm going to be a great-grandpa, but my name is Ben, and that's what I want to be called." So the grandson is born, and in fact, Ben measures up to being a great-grandparent, and they become very close. And then when the little boy's about 3.5, he's in preschool, and it's Grandfather's Day, Grandparents' Day. So the kid is playing over in the corner, and he looks up, and here comes Ben through the door, and the kid says, "Ben, what are you doing here?" And Ben says to the kid, "It's Grandparents' Day. I'm your grandfather." And the kid looks at him and said, "You are?" So I think that's the conflict.
Well, in the absence of folks at the mic, how about a lightning round of just the kind of quick answers which journalism should not indulge in, but nevertheless, all right? Occupy Wall Street.
Putting without a theme at this point. I think it doesn't have enough definition. I think the best thing that they've come up with is 1 in 99. That's a very smart phrase, and it also has the added virtue of being true. I mean, that really is the nub of what a lot of the rage in the country is. I was talking to Meredith about this today, that we've just done some in-depth polling, and there's much more sympathy for Occupy Wall Street than there is for the Tea Party across a lot of lines in America, class lines and economic lines and partisan lines, for that matter. I did an audience today in Los Angeles, very Republican, and I was very surprised by how many of them came up to me and said, if we don't do something about economic and income inequity in this country, we're going to have big, big prices to pay downstream. So people are beginning to be concerned about it.
Third party.
You need a horse. No one knows that better than you do, Marty. There's an effort underway called Elect USA. It's an online convention, which they've got a number of phases that they'll go through. But in the end, you need somebody that you can rally behind and that you believe in. Ross Perot is a perfect example. Ralph Nader had his own constituency before he decided to run. So you need to invest in someone. And I don't know who's out there who could kind of be the rallying point for a third party in 12. There's a lot of appetite for it as you go around the country, but no one knows better than you do. These two parties are built in across America. Secretaries of States run the elections, and they control the Congress, and they're deeply rooted in America, and it's tough to unroot that.
The Penn State scandal.
It's the worst example of something that has been, and I have to be careful about how I describe this, but it's a perfect example of how we've allowed the football culture in America to take over so many of these great academic institutions. Now, having said that, I am an unalloyed college football fan. I love college football. I've gone to 2 games this year, one at Ole Miss and one at the University of Iowa. I watch on Saturdays, while I know the teams are not. But they've lost control in the academy about the culture of college football. And they live in a bubble. And they think the rules that they live by are the ones that they create, and the other rules have no application to them. Just a perfect small example. When the recession really hit hard, and it hit Florida very hard, I was at Florida State, and the president of Florida State was a former football player at Florida State and a former speaker of the Florida legislature. And suddenly they had all their funding greatly reduced, and he went to the football program, Bobby Bowden, famous coach, and he said, guys, we have to change. We can't travel as many people. We're going to cut down on the number of people who are flying. We've got to figure out ways that we're going to save a lot of money. And the coaching staff looked at him and said, why? And he said, because we have a recession. And they said, so? And he said, don't you read the papers? And they said, we read the sports pages. And then he said, all of us have to make cutbacks. And they said, we never have before. We're not going to do it now. That's what you have across the country. The new coach at Ohio State, Urban Meyer, which has been hired, he got a $4 million signing bonus with a lot of things built in. And that's out of, you can still have college football. You can still have great games, and you have school spirit. But we really have lost something in terms of values at these universities. And you look at other departments that are, just scrapping for money, and it's tough.
Newt.
I'm surprised, frankly, that he's doing as well in the polls. I thought when the Tiffany's bill showed up and everybody left him, that would be the end of it. I think it is a commentary on how this is a party in search of a date for the prom, and they're kind of from
Looks
week
like
to week they go. And the other piece of it is, quite honestly, this is something to keep in mind. Newt is a well-known name, and name recognition is a big part of it now. And a lot of the junkies are involved in the process at the moment. This will begin to change when you get to the first of the year. Iowans and New Hampshire residents will start thinking, okay, who do I want as my nominee? Who can I see in the Oval Office? And we'll see who holds up. 4 years ago, at about this time, Rudy Giuliani was a leading candidate on the Republican side, and so was Fred Thompson, who's now doing reverse mortgages on television. So there can be a very swift change.
Climate change.
I think that's the right word or right phrase, climate change. I think global warming got a lot of people a little confused about it, and it opened up opportunities for challengers. I think it's real. I've done 2 documentaries on it. I believe that the vast majority of the climate scientists in the world know what they're talking about. And then if you just stand back and you think just about the amount of CO2 that is emitted into atmosphere on a Sunday night on the 405 between 6 and midnight as people are pouring up the 405, of course it's going to have an impact. And by the way, I travel a lot to the wilderness areas of northern Canada and other places, and a perfect example of it is that we were in British Columbia a couple of years ago fishing, and I asked the guy something about big game hunting, and he said, well, we now have an elk population. And I said, what do you mean you now have one? He said, well, we didn't have one before. They were in the lower 48. He said, but as the warmer temperatures in the lower 48 have begun to change their foraging and their migratory patterns, they're all moving up here. That's happening in a lot of places. It's not just the polar bear business. We're having profound changes. Look at our weather patterns, not just in this country, but around the world. It's a big issue. And the second big issue, and right there with it, obviously, is water. What are we going to do about water? And how are we going to have enough water to sustain the needs of our society?
Germany's attitude toward the rest of Europe.
I don't blame them. I don't. I was the only correspondent the night the Berlin Wall came down. And think about that. Here is this country that in 1989 it had not been, 45 years earlier, they'd been defeated in the greatest war in the history of mankind. They were trying to live down the shame of Nazism and fascism. And they had West Germany that had put itself back together, and they had a stable political system. Now suddenly they've got to take in their cousins from the East. And they stepped up to it, and they've done it. They still have real issues there. I mean, there's still very high unemployment in the East, and it's still a kind of a looking down your noses at the East Germans. Angela Merkel, the chancellor in Germany, walked across the wall the night the wall came down. She was a laboratory technician in East Germany, a 20-year-old laboratory technician. And think of where she's come from. That country has put itself back together again, and it is the economic engine of Central Europe. And I think what's really in play here is whether the Eurozone can survive. And when you look at what's going on in Greece and in Portugal and in Spain, and the Germans are saying to themselves, we worked this hard to put our country back together, and then we have to go over there and bail them out. And then in this country, if you're out in Emporia, Kansas, and you're looking at the big financial institutions in the East, and you're saying, Greece got the flu and we're getting pneumonia? How does that work? See, these are the issues that we have to have on the table.
Pakistan.
It's the damnedest place I've ever been in so many ways. It's not reliable as an ally. It's very tribal. I've always felt that the army was more sympathetic to Islamic rage than the Pakistani leaders were willing to acknowledge. I've been all over Pakistan. It's just very hard for me to describe to you how forbidding the border region is between Pakistan and Afghanistan. I've both flown over it and I've been on the ground. There are 3 different times. They make the mountains there and the valleys there make the most severe part of the Rockies or the Sierra Nevada look like foothills. I mean, it is unbelievable how remote this area is. And you can see people coming for hundreds of miles, and they're very strong tribes up and down that region. And they don't feel any loyalty to the national state of Pakistan. They feel loyalty to their tribes. And they're a nuclear power. And that's really scary to me about what they are. We've got big issues in the subcontinent. We can't live with them, and we can't live without them. And we never quite know who's going to be in charge there. The ambassador from Pakistan, Haqqani, has been forced to resign because he asked the United States for more help in controlling the Pakistani military. Think about that. Actually, Meredith and I were at a conference in which he was saying this off the record earlier in the summer because they were being asked about these reports of the Pakistani military being more pro-Islamic radical than anyone would like them to be. It's a very, very tough piece. It's the most explosive part of the world right now.
China.
We are really witnessing something of epic proportions with the changes in China. I didn't go on Nixon's first trip. I went in 1974 with President Ford, and it was like entering a mid-19th century country. In Beijing, I would go out in the morning, and I was living in a hotel that had been built in 1928. It was the most modern hotel in Beijing. I'd go out in the morning for a run, and I'd run through the hutongs, which are the communal villages, and they looked very much like something that you would have expected to see in about 1860. They had communal water taps and communal bathrooms, and they had outdoor kitchens. This is the heart of the capital. China was just emerging from the Cultural Revolution. It had been roiled in ways that's very hard for us to imagine in this country. It's now the second largest economy in the world. And it has problems. I think the Chinese still don't know what they don't know in many ways. 400 million people will be moving from the countryside into the cities. They're all going to want houses, cars, modern appliances. And I believe, from a political point of view, the big issue is that I don't see how China keeps the lid on, especially when it comes to sharing information and social media, when it comes to the internet and information technology. Right now, as we're sitting here, there's some Chinese kid who's hacking in. You just know that. And if that becomes, in a way, kind of viral in China, it's how do they keep the lid on?
There are two questioners. We're near the end of our time. Could I ask each of you to ask your questions, and then Tom will answer? If you could just both. So we'll just start here.
Thank you. I'm just curious, you spoke a little bit about Wall Street, Marty, and Tom, you spoke a little bit about, or a lot about, government and what needs to be fixed. And we hear very often how government and big business are in big bed together. In your experience, do you think they really are in bed together? And if so, do you think it's possible that their interests would actually align in a benevolent way to get us out of this mess?
And can you ask your question as well? I don't know how many more we're going to be able to do, so let's...
Well, actually, I don't have a question. I want to thank you because I watched you as a teenager on Channel 4 and the news, and I watched the little clock go tick, tick, tick. But more importantly, I want to thank you for writing The Greatest Generation. Because of you, my father, who never talked about his trials and his during World War II and how he almost died, opened it up. And he shared his life, and he now he talks to high schoolers about what he went through as a teenager to make this country safe for all of us. And if it hadn't been for you, my dad would have never started talking about it. Thank you.
Thank you. And Marty, in a way, that statement is not disconnected from the question about Wall Street, because the people who came home from that war and created the modern Wall Street were statesmen of finance, and they had proportion. They made a lot of money, there's no question about that. But they felt an obligation to the financial underpinning of this country and to having a responsible financial services industry in America. And somewhere in the latter part of in the closing days of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st century, things went wildly out of control. And then the street was taken over not by people who were just financiers, but they were traders for the most part. And with the advent of the new technology, they could create one instrument after another, and technology took over. And we never caught up to it. And then the numbers got to be so big in terms of how much money they can make. We're now 40% of our GDP is made up of financial services. We don't make things. We trade money. I've said to a number of people in Wall Street, and we're not going to eliminate Wall Street. We still need a financial services industry. You know, they provide capital for businesses that are starting. They help communities and states underwrite their bonds, and that's going to go on. But if Wall Street doesn't begin to reform itself from within, Dodd and Frank that's just the beginning in terms of the regulations that will come after them, and they'll become pariahs. So, they're very reluctant to step up and do this, and for reasons I still don't completely understand. I thought a number of the Wall Street firms that took the big TARP payments, their senior management, all of whom were very wealthy, should have said, we're $1 a year until we pay all this back. Mm. You know, that would have been a statement that I think would have resonated across the country. But they didn't do that. We had all those bonuses being paid. You know, one of my neighbors in New York was running Merrill Lynch, and he almost destroyed the company, and he walked out with a $132 million payout. I mean, I just don't know how you explain that.
One of the wonderful things about talking to Tom Brokaw is that there's almost there's literally no topic that Tom doesn't have not only something thoughtful to say, but real personal experience that contributes to that, not just book learning. So
don't ask me to do any physics.
So just as important as this conversation is what comes after it, which is a chance to buy Tom's book, The Time of Our Lives, from Skylight Bookstore. It's holiday season, as Andrea said. And so what I'd like you to do, please, is join me in thanking Tom Brokaw.